Welcome to BARC's September Ecology Club, Insect Apocalypse, What is Happening, Why It Matters, and How You Can Help. BARC's Ecology Club is a monthly gathering on the second Wednesday of each month to discuss a theme or topic that pertains to BARC's work to develop a deeper appreciation and understanding of the region's ecology. BARC's mission is to transform Mount Hood National Forest into a place where natural processes prevail, where wildlife thrives, and where local communities have a social, cultural, and economic investment in its restoration and preservation. Since 1999, BARC has organized people and communities from communities around Mount Hood National Forest to keep watch over the ecological conditions of the Forest Service and the actions of the forest and the actions of the federal agency tasked with managing these public lands, the Forest Service. You can find more information at www.bark-out.org or find BARC on Facebook or Instagram at BARC for Mount Hood. My name is Misha Van Eaton. I work as BARC's Forest Watch Assistant, and I am your host for tonight. Before we get started with tonight's presentation, I would like to invite you all to participate in BARC's land acknowledgement practice. This is a practice that BARC has developed for all of our events. I'll begin by reading this accountability statement. As an organization founded by white people in the lineage of settler colonial environmentalism, BARC understands that conservation work is embedded in the white supremacist legacy of colonization, of land theft, cultural erasure and genocide, and the systemic use of law to suppress Native sovereignty over their homelands. We understand that BARC's dedication to protecting the stolen lands, now referred to as the public lands of Mount Hood National Forest, carries with it a paradox which continues to be ignored by most conservation groups and which continues to harm Indigenous people. In our advocacy and policy work, BARC's interactions with federal agencies often comply with the authority assumed by the U.S. federal government. This authority was assumed through the legalized displacement and genocide of Indigenous people and cultures, including through the legislative creation of public lands. These crimes and injustices have not been reconciled nor rectified. Today, all settlers and non-Native people have the privilege of primary access to these public lands as a direct result of this strategy of legalized supremacy. BARC recognizes that conservation organizations like ours are complicitly participating in the ongoing displacement of Native people and culture each time settlers and other non-Indigenous people claim the benefits of access to this land and by engaging in the paradox of protecting stolen land. We are working to change the vision, mission, and strategies of our organization. BARC affirms that these are the rightful homelands of the Multnomah, Molalla, Kalapuya, Chinook, Clackamas, Tenino, Wasco, Wishram, Paiute, and the many other Native people who live here and who have always lived here, who have always belonged to and cared for this land, and whose bold resistance to colonial oppression should guide us all. Now I would like to respectfully invite any Native people here today to have a few minutes to speak freely. If you would like to speak, you can go ahead and unmute yourself or type into the chat. BARC is committing to the work necessary to repair relationships between settler descendants and Indigenous people, and between all non-Indigenous people and the land. Acknowledgement is just the necessary first step in this revolutionary cultural work. We ask all non-Indigenous participants to practice humility, respect, and acknowledgement by personally dedicating your time, energy, action, and resources to support the people who rightfully belong to this land. If you have practiced acknowledgement with BARC before, please get the notebook you use for this practice. If this is your first practice, please get something to write with. I'll give everyone about 20 seconds to go do that. Okay. Please take the next 2 to 3 minutes to write some instructions, intentions, actions, and next steps for yourself, outlining how you will develop your practice of acknowledgement through action. If you have been to a recent BARC event, please revisit what you have set out for yourself to do and take this time to reflect on your efforts and update your intention and action plan. Take another 30 seconds to wrap up your writing. Okay. Now, please set aside your journal and turn your attention away from yourself. And please join me in a moment of respectful silence and contemplation and humility in honor of the original people here tonight, across the continent, in the past, present, and the future. Thank you all for supporting this important practice and learning. It's important that you continue to practice acknowledgement through action in all areas of your life. Okay, so tonight we are lucky to have Scott Hoffman Black presenting on the latest science on insect declines, forest and range management, threats and solutions, and how managers and activists can incorporate invertebrate conservation into their work. Scott Hoffman Black is an internationally recognized conservationist who has been at the forefront of the conservation movement for 3 decades. He is an executive director of the Xerces Society, which under his leadership has become the premier invertebrate conservation organization in North America. Scott's work has led to habitat protection, restoration, and improved management on millions of acres and rangelands, forests, and farmland, as well as protection for dozens of rare and endangered species. And he is an author of the best-selling Attracting Native Pollinators and Gardening for Butterflies, and has written more than 200 other publications. And with that, I'll hand it over to Scott.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I really, really appreciate it. And thanks so much for that thoughtful beginning to these meetings. I see so many meetings where people just launch in, and I really think that was really, really wonderful. I happen to be the non-biological through marriage, father of a daughter with Creek and Choctaw heritage. And so we have thought a lot about some of these issues. Today, I'm going to talk about the insect apocalypse, what's really happening, why it matters, and how you can be part of the solution. And before I give talks, I've given talks all around the world, now through Zoom, but before in other venues. And I always like to make sure I do my thank yous up front, so that I make sure I thank the important people that help make this work possible. First and foremost, I need to thank my family. They both inspire and empower me to do this work. My 3 kids and my wife know that this is a passion of mine and has always been a passion of mine, and really are part of everything that I do. So I do it for them, but they also help me in the work that I do. I also want to thank Xerces members. We have, we are a membership organization, just as BARC is. These members are who help drive our work. I'd want to thank well over 100 scientists we work with, It's federal, state, and local agencies. We sometimes battle with these agencies, but there are many good people at these agencies as well. Hundreds of farmers, great companies who are actually trying to make the world a place, private foundations, and then tens of thousands of community scientists and everyday people. And we are a donor nonprofit. I mean, we're a nonprofit that accepts donations. So once you've given as much as you can to Bark, think about if you've got additional funding and want to support us after the talk. I also want to thank the incredible staff that I have. These are the people really out there doing the hard work of conservation. They're amazing, amazing, dedicated people, and they're really what make the Xerces Society work. For those of you who don't know what Xerces Society is, it is pronounced the Xerces Society, and we are named after the first butterfly to go extinct due to humans that we know of, the Xerces blue butterfly, the first butterfly in North America. We probably drove others to extinction. This was the first one that was documented in the 1940s as San Francisco expanded. They built houses over the last of its habitat. And we're pretty holistic. We do education, conservation research, and advocacy to protect invertebrates and their habitat. And we start by understanding the animals that we're trying to protect and conserve. So we work with agencies, but also private landowners, with researchers to understand the management needs of both rare and at-risk invertebrates, as well as groups like freshwater mussels and pollinators. We harness tens of thousands now of people actually to help gather really important data through our community science efforts. And you may have heard these called citizen science efforts. We really were one of the early groups who felt that citizen is a pretty charged word. So this is what some people call citizen science. We call it community science. Bumblebee watch, monarch efforts, freshwater mussels, you name it. We've got people out there helping to get us data. We do a lot of outreach and education. We've reached over 150,000 people through trainings all across North America, as well as other places around the world. And we also do policy and advocacy. I feel strongly, have always felt strongly. I'm a scientist. Scientists need to speak up. We need to be vocal. We need to make sure that the issues that we care about and the issues that we're knowledgeable about, we talk about to the people in power. And then last, to me, it's really about what happens on the ground. And we've protected and restored over 2.5 million acres for invertebrates. And we've improved management on tens of millions of acres for these animals. And so I'm very fortunate to be where I am today. So my talk today is partially based on some papers that I've helped develop and write. The first one, declines in insect and diversity. We know enough to act now. The second one is opinion piece, 8 simple actions that individuals can take to save insects from global declines. There's also an entire issue in PNAS, the journal on global insect decline, that you might check out if you really want a deep dive after you hear my talk. So today I'm going to talk about the importance of invertebrates, kind of the why care, what evidence we have that they're declining, what's causing that decline. And then I'm going to dive into nature-based climate solutions and climate-ready habitat solutions that I feel we cannot talk about biodiversity loss without talking about climate change. And we shouldn't talk about climate change without talking about biodiversity loss. So I'll talk about that. So why care about these animals? Well, insects and their allies represent the vast majority of described animal species. This is a pictogram. You can see that over here on the right, there's a giant beetle. That beetle denotes over 1 million described insect species. You add crustaceans, you add mollusks, you add worms and other invertebrates, and that's about 1.5 million species that are documented as invertebrates. You think about mammals, you think about birds. There's in the tens of thousands of those species, and I'm not by any means saying that they're not important. They are incredibly important. What I'm trying to get you to understand is there's a lot of insects out there, a lot of different species. And what's even more incredible is that the, this is what we don't know. Their conservative estimates are that there are likely 7 million uh, invertebrate species on the planet. We just have not described most of them. And what this means is this diversity means that these invertebrates have radiated to just a great number of niches in terrestrial, freshwater, aquatic, marine, and marine ecosystems. They're really driving these ecosystems from the bottom up. And this is true for Northwest forests as well. One study found that there were 3,400 different species of arthropods in less than 7,000 hectare in an old growth forest in Oregon. And that is incredible diversity. And, again, diversity begets importance because these animals are helping drive these systems, which I'll get into. People don't think about it, but invertebrates are also the animal heavyweights of the planet. There are so many species, and there's so much, so many individuals that they really make up the majority of what we call biomass. And so this study in Costa Rica found that invertebrates made up more than 90% of terrestrial biomass. You might think that in a rainforest, there's lots of insects, lots of other invertebrates. That kind of makes sense. But this is a really neat paper that came out in 2018 that documented biomass across the planet. And you'll see that box on the left that plants, even though plants aren't as diverse, there aren't as many species, they really do make up the majority of the biomass. But if you look at that little square at the bottom, little triangle at the bottom of animals, you'll see that when that is blown up, the vast majority of animals are either arthropods, which are insects, spiders, their allies, mollusks, annelids. This is what's diverse. Fish are also, this is what the major biomass. Fish are also there's a lot of fish and make up biomass as well. But having that diversity, having that biomass means that we have species in all these niches. There's a lot of them, and they're all doing really important things, providing really important services. They're part of nearly every food chain. 96% of songbirds rear their young on invertebrates. We would not have songbirds or many other bird species without these small animals. If you want to see salmon in your streams, you can thank midges that are at the headwaters of these streams where those salmon are born. They would not make it to the ocean without macroinvertebrates in these streams. I like to use the example of a grizzly bear because people think, what, grizzly bear and insects? Well, think about it. Grizzly bears eat salmon, and those rely on invertebrates. Their other major food source is berries, which rely on insects for pollination. So you can drive this out any way you want, but these animals are really, really important as food sources for other animals. They're also really important for helping turn over materials. They decompose over 90% of plant, human, and animal waste. So insects and animals like this millipede are really extremely important because without breaking down these into smaller parts, the microbes that then break them down into very small parts would not be able to do so. Most people have heard of pollination. More than 85% of flowering plants require an animal, mostly insects, to move pollen. Over 85%. That's a large majority. I don't want to forget to truly dive a little bit into our freshwater systems. Invertebrates really drive these systems through food for other animals, but also in certain cases by helping clean streams. These are freshwater mussels. They're found throughout rivers and streams in the Pacific Northwest, and they're really vital for these systems. They benefit fish because they improve habitat conditions. They create refuge for other smaller invertebrates that are prey to other fish as well as birds, and they help clean these rivers. And they've got an incredible life cycle that is tied to native fish, where the salmon produce eggs that attach themselves to the gills of fish. The fish are what move these animals around. And it's reciprocal, though, because if you have a good salmon bed or a good freshwater mussel bed, they're very good for native fish. Just the incredible, the incredible dynamics of these natural systems are amazing to me. And you saw me in the suit earlier talking about advocacy. Some people don't care. I care about all that stuff. That's what I care about. But, when I go to Washington, D.C. or I go to Salem, I can talk about how important these are from a dollar value, about $70 billion a year in today's dollars in the United States alone. That's the economic value. Sometimes I hate talking about economic value, but it is important to point out. So these animals are really important. We should care about them, and we should be thoughtful about them when we're thinking about management of any system. But unfortunately, these animals are in trouble, just as many other animals in North America and across the world are. An increasing number of studies are showing declines in most types of insects, which I'll talk about. Now, a lot of people have talked about pollinators. We have used pollinators kind of as a gateway to talking about biodiversity generally, because pollinators resonate with people. But the evidence is that pollinators are really declining. And I do want to mention that when I'm talking about pollinators, I'm talking about native pollinators. Many people focus on honeybees. Honeybees are important for our agricultural systems. The idea using honeybees grew as our industrial agricultural systems grew. They also make great honey. But honeybees are not threatened with extinction. There's actually more honeybees on Earth now than there ever have been in the past. This is an issue for beekeepers because beekeepers lose a lot of honeybees every year. It's an issue for large-scale agriculture, but it isn't a biodiversity issue, and I wanted to point that out. So I'm talking about all of the other flower visitors, the ones that were in North America when the native peoples were here, not the honeybee, which we actually brought with us, us Europeans, I should say. So some groups we know quite a bit about, but as you can imagine, when we study insects and other invertebrates with 1.5 million species, it is really mind-boggling to wrap our brains around it. So we often pick groups, and then we can assess groups and then make informed decisions based on those groups. And bumblebees are one of the manageable group with 57 species in North America, US, Canada, and Mexico. But an assessment done by Xerces and the International Union of Conservation of Nature found that 28% of bumblebees in North America are threatened, 41% in Mesoamerica, and our colleagues in Europe found that 23% of bumblebee species are threatened with extinction there. Those are large numbers that we should be concerned about. These are really important animals. These include many Pacific Northwest species, like the western bumblebee and Morrison's bumblebee, which can be found in and around forests here, including on Mount Hood. Butterflies are another well-studied group. They've studied butterflies for decades and decades in Europe, and studies from across Europe are just showing declines across the board. A 10-year study in the UK found that 52% of butterfly species have declined in abundance at monitored sites. A recent study that came out in Science in the Western US, right here, found that butterfly abundance is declining across the West at 1.6% a year for the last 2 decades. Startling numbers. And research is showing that widespread species like the monarch are in free fall. Western monarchs have declined by 99.9%. We used to have monarchs that flew from Eastern Oregon, Washington, Idaho, other parts of the West, California. We used to likely have 4.5 million monarchs. Last year, the Xerces Society and our community scientists counted less than 2,000. These animals we may lose that migration. So species also like Taylor's checker spot, which was historically found throughout the Pacific Northwest on prairies. We don't think of Pacific Northwest in prairies, but the Willamette Valley and the Puget Trough was all prairie, and now most of it's gone, and with it, some of its residents, like many of the populations of Taylor's checker spot. So work I did through the UN with over 300 authors, we looked at a lot of this data and found that over 40% of invertebrate pollinator species are facing extinction. But it's not just pollinators. We've got studies showing declines in freshwater aquatic species as well. One study in the Midwest found that biomass of mayflies had declined by 50%. Now, I do want to point out that and I'll talk more at the end, doing positive actions has positive consequences. There are studies that show where we have done good aquatic management, cleaning up water, solid riparian areas, we're seeing increases in abundance of freshwater species. But about a third of tiger beetle species in the US are also threatened. So to summarize, while there's a lot of variation, because as you imagine, there's so many of these different animals doing so many of these different things, what is really interesting is most of the studies are finding abundance falling from 1 to 2% a year, which when you get that confidence, whether it's butterflies or tiger beetles or other species, you start to see that this is really happening. This is not something that's just one or two or three different groups of animals. And all species are worth protecting. They really are. But this crisis is much larger, and we will start and have started to lose key ecological functions across the world. So what is going on and why is this happening? Well, it's because of us. Despite their diversity of ecologies and life histories, pretty much you can chalk it up to that we destroy habitat. We destroy habitat in the way we live. We destroy habitat in the way we farm. And we often leave no habitat in some of these areas for these animals that need it. But it's not just habitat loss, it's habitat degradation. And, we have sometimes semi-intact areas that aren't lost, but they're so degraded through grazing, logging, mowing, invasive plants, too much fire, conifer encroachment, which is the opposite of that, off-road vehicles. There are just so many issues that these animals face. So habitat loss and degradation. And this, of course, forests are key. Logging and fire suppression have led definitely to the loss of invertebrate diversity. And these simplified forests are definitely at more risk from insect outbreaks as well, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. Pesticides are a major factor and a very difficult one to focus on, but there are really second to habitat loss in the reasons for invertebrate decline, and use on farms and for things like mosquito management are really problematic. But I do want to point out that some studies show that we use more pesticides per acre in urban and suburban areas than in many agricultural areas. And this is in the quest for this perfect lawn and the perfect rows. And we really need to cut our pesticide habit. This also happens on forests. Large scale herbicide treatments after logging destroy and degrade the plants that are vital for insects and other invertebrates. There are several other issues that I'll go through quickly, but that can be consequential. So disease, we are now moving around the planet and we're moving animals around the planet. And when we move animals around the planet, we move their diseases. And bumblebee declines across the world are linked to moving commercial bumblebees into areas where diseases escape and affect their wild relatives. This is a very important issue globally. We also move insects that become invasive and eat other insects, and we often do it on purpose. This is biological control. The nine-spotted lady beetle has been extirpated from large areas. It used to be the New York State insect, and yet it's likely extirpated from New York because we introduced non-native lady beetles to control crop pests. Those lady beetles you might buy at your garden center, please don't do that. These come from different places. The ones you buy at garden centers are shoveled up from the Sierra Nevada in the winter and shipped all over the country. And this is a practice that people think is helpful, and it really is not. Lights are a really important factor. The planet, if you look at some of those photos from space, is just full of light, and light really messes up insects like fireflies and moths. They aren't able to mate well, and they're in major decline as well, partially because of lights. Of course, climate change. Climate exerts powerful effects. It's already here. The climate crisis. We need all of our attention focused on it. This new study suggests that climate is a major driver of wild bees and the decline of wild bees and butterflies. And so you put it all together, and a colleague of mine, Dave Wagner, called it death by 1,000 cuts. If you look at the top part of this, these are all climate change related, whether they be fire, storm intensity, droughts, and then we've got the habitat loss, habitat degradation, introduced species. It's hard to be wildlife right now on the planet because we seem to be trying our best to knock them out. So what do we do? That's depressing, and I always get a little depressing even going through my talk. But I believe there are solutions, and I've seen them work. I've seen them work on a local and regional scale, and we just need to really focus on doing more of this. So what we do know is that if we hope to stem the losses of insects and other invertebrates and the really important services they provide, we've got to work at all societal levels. We've got to protect, restore, and enhance native plant habitat across landscapes, from wildlands to farmlands to urban cores. And although there's gaps in research, a paper that I wrote, I really firmly think I showed that we need to connect these habitats. Insects and other invertebrates need to move across the landscape. They need to move just because they need to move to find mates and other things, but they are now moving because of the climate crisis, and we need to provide for that movement. We also need to really reduce stressors such as pesticides. And these nature-based climate solutions, I believe, are a really important way forward. We should be thinking about management on all our landscapes through the lens of the climate crisis. And, really, I believe it's climate change and biodiversity. It's a win-win or a lose-lose. Biodiversity is vital and plays a really important role in climate mitigation and adaptation, thus making it a key contribution to our efforts on climate change. At the same time, meeting mitigation targets is essential to avert biodiversity loss. So you really can't do one without the other. And so at Xerces, we've been really focusing both our restoration, our management, our outreach. We have worked with nurseries to grow native plants. We're thinking about the climate crisis in all of our work. Climate change is not a separate program at Xerces, because I really believe climate change has to be in everything we do. And natural climate solutions can reduce greenhouse gas emissions related to land use. They can capture and store carbon dioxide, and they can improve this resilience. So helping plant and animal communities to adapt. And a study recently came out that I was not involved in, but shows that these nature-based climate solutions could be about 20% of our carbon capture, keeping us below 1.5 or 2 degrees C. So they're both really important for carbon capture. They're really important for biodiversity. Now, we need to do this in all landscapes, and we do need a focus in towns and cities. They're really essential to our conservation solution. 80% of people live in towns and cities. And invertebrate conservation, the neat thing is the data shows it can happen at any scale. Even beelawns and urban meadows, you see an increase in diversity and abundance when you put in habitat. And this is really, really important. Xerces manages an effort that's called Bee City USA, where cities and towns and campuses can basically move forth with pollinator conservation on a big scale, and then they can become a Bee City USA and promote what they're doing, which also helps in outreach. We have over 250 cities and campuses across the country so far, and we're getting more every week. And there really are consequential. Since in 2019 alone, we completed 876 pollinator habitat projects, and about the same in 2020. I just haven't updated this slide. And since 2019, we've reached over 800,000 people through our pollinator conservation message. And as a person who grew up in a city without really a lot of nature around me, I'm the youngest of 10 kids. We didn't have a lot of money. We didn't go on big vacations. But having a natural area close to me, I spent the natural area, which is now all houses, by the way. It wasn't a natural area. It was just an area that didn't have houses, that had a little stream and a little meadow. And I'd catch fireflies at night and butterflies by day and pick up lizards and snakes. It was awesome. My mom had to drag me away from there all the time. We need places throughout cities and towns so that people, young people, all young people could go and see nature. And insects can be a neat way to see nature because you can see it up close. But agriculture is another key and vital aspect of this. 40% of the land on our planet is used for agriculture. We need to move away from fence row to fence row pesticide and chemical fertilizer, soil degrading farming. And we have to move to a more ecological approach in our farming systems. And restoration is a vital component of this, because many of our ag systems, we have to now try to bring nature back to them. And there are many agricultural nature-based solutions that can help local farm biodiversity and help, as I said, mitigate and adapt for climate change. And this is just a list that of the many, many practices that farmers can do, and that many farmers are doing. We have a lot of farmers who are stepping up to try to raise our food in a more ethical and environmentally friendly manner. And this is across North America. We've got we put in 100 miles of hedgerow habitats across California. We've put in huge projects in Montana. This is a dryland wheat organic, one of the largest organic dryland wheat farms in Montana. Vegetables in Minnesota, biodynamic farms in New York, you name it. We're working with our farmer partners to do a better job. But you should beware a little bit of organizations that are promoting pollinator conservation if they're not talking pesticides, because there are a lot of projects that I get a little concerned about that are potentially putting habitat where it is vulnerable to the animals you're trying to protect being poisoned. So it's really not all about the flowers. We have to deal with the pesticides in the landscape, because there are many studies that show that these pesticides are not staying where we put them. They are moving out across the landscape and impacting, areas that are flower rich, where these animals need to survive. And the production and use of pesticides are also a really significant source of greenhouse gases. And I know a lot of people have talked about neonicotinoids, and neonicotinoids are a really terrible class of insecticides that can cause great harm. And Xerces has a huge focus on neonicotinoids. But we also believe if we're going to solve this problem, we have to move beyond certain classes of insecticides and just work on integrated or ecological pest management. We can use these systems to protect biodiversity, to help climate change, and to either minimize or eliminate pesticides in these systems. But also, the work you do at Bark is terribly, terribly important and vital. I like to think of the wild areas, the natural areas, as really the glue that holds all of this together. We have to be working in cities, we have to be working on ag, but we have to maintain what we have of our wild areas. It's imperative for the climate crisis, it's imperative for the biodiversity crisis. So, logging, grazing, fire management, recreation, we need to be working on ways to minimize the impacts and to maximize the benefits to plant and insect diversity of these issues. And one of the keys is maintaining at all costs and restoring high quality late successional and old growth forests. You saw that slide early on where there were 3,400 identified species of insects in a pretty small area. That's huge. These areas contain an array of invertebrates, including rare invertebrates, as well as natural predators and pathogens of what might become pests. These areas, the data seems to suggest, anyway, highly that they're also resistant to some of these pest attacks. And there are so many cool animals in these forests. I love this picture. It's looking like it's just puckering up to kiss you. This is Malone's jumping slug. And that's right, it's a jumping slug, which I just find incredibly cool. And they live in coarse woody debris and moss mats and decaying logs in older forests. And it evolved to jump, which is pretty cool, because its main predator is a snail that finds its slime trail and then will follow that slime trail until it catches up to another snail or a slug, and then it just slowly engulfs it because the snail's big and it's fast. These jumping slugs jump. They only jump a little, but they jump enough and corkscrew away that, and snails are almost blind, that the snail just kind of comes to a dead end of the slime trail and can't find its dinner. So anyway, I find these animals just fascinating and interesting. There's also one of the few butterflies that live in our old growth forests is right here in the Pacific Northwest, and it's called Johnson hairstreak. and they only lay their eggs on conifer mistletoe, and they're mostly found in older forests of the Pacific Northwest. So these forests are vital generally for biodiversity, but here's some of the animals that we will lose if we lose these forests. I'm going to admit somebody, okay? So we also just, in all of our land management, and this is what Xerces, I think, has been fairly successful in doing, is starting to rethink insects and starting to talk with land managers about what an ecosystem approach would look like if we start to think about insects. You know, at the community level, outbreaks of plant-eating insects can actually help these systems maintain health. Now, systems are out of whack. We've had fire suppression, we have the climate crisis, and so that's not always the case anymore. But we need to be thoughtful that we don't have knee-jerk reaction to quote unquote what we think of as pests that are really just herbivores, and they're native herbivores of these forest plants. And we really need, and I know I'm talking to people that know so much about this, so but I want to say it anyway. We have to ensure structural and species diversity when logging, and we've got to retain large trees and snags and downed wood and canopy closure. You know, these practices are really essential. And I think they're essential for a biodiversity perspective, they're essential from a climate perspective, and they're essential from minimizing large outbreaks of insects that can cause larger scale issues with some of our forests. And the data is clear. I've written several papers on bark beetles and other forest pests. And the data is really clear that we can't cut our way out of this. Once you have a bark beetle outbreak or an outbreak of another quote unquote pest, I almost don't want to call them pests, but it's what the papers call them and people think of them that way. They're native insects. We can't log our way out of it. There's widespread scientific consensus that once these bark beetle outbreaks reach epidemic levels, it's futile to try to do that. The data is also generally clear that thinning forests, although can be an important part of restoration, and Xerces, with conifer encroachment for some of our pollinator species have worked with the agencies on some thinning plans. But if done with non-ecological goals in mind, board feet, it can really be highly detrimental. And there's really little evidence that using thinning controls bark beetles. There are some studies that say maybe at the stand level, but they're kind of equivocal. But there's no studies that show that you can stop an outbreak at the landscape level by thinning. So as I said, Xerces supports some thinning. We worked with the BLM in Southern Oregon. These are really important meadows. Some of them have a margin skipper butterfly, which is a really rare butterfly. Some of them also have western bumblebee. And, we have a light approach. We removed up to 6-inch trees from across quite a few meadows to just improve this meadow habitat, because margin skipper does not do well in shade, and these meadows were getting really shady. Salvage logging, again, I know I'm speaking to people that understand this. After insect outbreaks or after fire, just make matters worse. There are so many predators, there are so many parasites that reside in dead and dying trees that we immediately eliminate, and that are that feedback loop to control other insect pests and provide food for wildlife. The road system is crazy across forests across the West, but certainly in Oregon. According to Oregon Wild, 71,000 miles. But these corridors definitely have been shown to be dispersal points for non-native insects and other invertebrates, as well as plant species, and are really bad for our streams and rivers when there's runoff. Now, we work on a lot of prescribed fire with land managers, and I'm actually helping put on a symposium that I can send Misha, and she can send that out. It's a symposium on fire and invertebrates, both prescribed and non-prescribed fire. That'll take place in October. We're putting it on with the Natural Areas Association. And prescribed fire is really important, but we also have to be really thoughtful about it. We have to understand the systems we're working in. I did a study on the Six Rivers National Forest, looking at a butterfly. And unfortunately, prescribed fire is probably not a good solution to conifer encroachment in that butterfly's habitat, because that butterfly, it kills all the butterflies within its path. And then if there are no butterflies to recolonize, you don't get recolonization. And even if there are butterflies, it's really, really slow. So prescribed fire is really important, but we need to really understand these systems we're working in and think about insects. And then cattle grazing. We have too many livestock out on our public lands, and they really alter the structure, diversity, and growth habits of the plant community, which in turn can affect the associated insect community. So there are ways to manage livestock in a way that has less of an impact, and we need to be focused on that. We really do need to change how we graze our public lands, because it can be done in a manner that is at least more compatible with biodiversity. But, we found in some cases our best friend is fence. And I know I don't like fences out on the landscape, but, we've used these type of fences that are dropped in the fall so that elk can graze to protect some of our rare butterfly species. And then just a couple concluding points. I'm a white man. I think you could all tell that if you saw my picture. And we need to broaden our community. And to conserve biodiversity and address the climate crisis, all people need to be actively seen and engaged as part of the solution. And the conservation community, Xerces totally included, has a lot more work to do to grow inclusivity, so that BIPOC communities and all communities can feel welcome in our work. And we must practice reciprocity to ensure we're showing up for our partners and expanding our partnerships equitably. This is whether we're working in forests, on farms, in cities, we have to do a better job. I know many of us are trying and many of us are working towards this. It's a long-term shift that we have to make for a lot of groups anyway. And but it's something that I appreciated how you started this meeting. And that's one of my concluding remarks there. I also know that you're doing great work. If you're associated with BARC and you are out protecting the forest, this is important. We have to maintain and protect the wild areas that we have. But all people can have a role. Your neighbors can have a role. Your parents can have a role. They don't necessarily have to be a forest activist. They can become a community scientist right in their own backyard by starting to look at bumblebees. People that have the means can support organic and sustainable agriculture, because we really need the way to change the way we grow crops. And not everybody can afford to buy sustainable and organic, but if you can, and if you know people that can, we should. We all need to take action to curb our personal carbon footprint. I'm not telling everybody they have to be this, but I'm a vegan and I do that because of climate. And we have to eliminate unneeded travel. One of the things that the pandemic, I think, has showed some of us in the conservation movement, including me, is that I don't need to travel as much. I can do meetings like this in Arkansas, in Maine. I've been involved in meetings in Europe and in Australia, although those happen in the middle of the night. Uh, but it can't all be about our own action. We have to change our governments. We have to change how we're focused on the climate crisis and on the biodiversity crisis. But I do want to end with the good news is that I've been doing this for a long time. And if you restore and manage habitat that includes pesticides, that includes other issues such as lights, you can see real change. These animals actually respond to habitat changes in a meaningful time frame on a local and regional level. We just have to have many more local and regional projects across the country where we can do this. And so I'll just end by saying, check out our website. We've got a lot of material, a lot of content on a whole variety of issues. You may or may not be aware of these two publications that I authored. The first, Logging to Control Insects, the Science and Myth Behind Managing Forest Insect Pests, and the second, Insects in Roadless Forests, the Scientific Review of Causes, Consequences, and Management Alternatives. This looks at forest insects and fire, and kind of explodes some of the myths around that. We also at Xerces have done a lot of rare species inventory and monitoring across the Mount Hood National Forest, as well as other forests in the Northwest. And from that, we have prepared over technical information on over 250 species that are found on Forest Service and BLM lands across the region, from management plans, conservation assessments, species reviews, prioritization. All of this can be found at the ISP website. It's the Forest Service BLM Interagency Special Status and Sensitive Species Program. But if you just type in ISSSSP, you'll find the website. There's more than just insects insects and other invertebrates on this website. There's a lot of really useful information that might help you in your work. And with that, I thank you for what you do. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me. I really, really honor and appreciate you and your work. And together we can make a difference. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Scott, for such a thorough presentation. Before we launch into Q&A, I just wanted to suggest a rephrasing for when you said when Native people were here, to refer to a time for, Thank
you for that. I appreciate that. Well appreciated.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm now writing that in the notebook that I was writing the other information in. So I
great. Yeah, so for everyone's understanding, since Native people are here on this continent today and have been here for time immemorial, a better way to phrase that could have been before European settlers arrived or started occupying and colonizing this continent. Thank you, Scott. Does anyone have any questions? If you would like to unmute and ask some questions, you can type stack in the chat like this, or you can type your question in the chat and I can read it aloud.
Oh, I know there is a big spray happening or going to happen in Eastern Oregon this year, I think in Idaho and Montana. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that and anything we could do policy-wise to prevent that from happening again or limit it.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I was doing my talk and did not have time to fit it in. I wanted to make sure I kept myself. There's a lot of information. So what Michael's talking about is the pesticide spraying to manage native grasshoppers. We, sorry, I'll back up. I guess I'm including myself, but as a society, we've thought of grasshoppers as a pest for a long time. And what we don't really realize, first and foremost, is that these animals across the West are native insects, that they're really, really important insects, that grasshoppers are some of the most important food sources for many of our rangeland birds, and many, many other animals, from coyotes and foxes to just a whole plethora of birds and other species. They also are really, really important for taking nutrients from plants and making them really available in the form of their frass, in the form of their poop. So they're really, really important. But the issue is that they sometimes eat the same plants as cows and other livestock do. So many producers of cattle and other livestock feel that they're a threat and feel that they are potentially impacting their livelihoods. Some of that is true and some of it actually isn't. Sometimes large grasshopper events will take some of the forage, but in many cases, it's a knee-jerk reaction that is not needed. So for years, whenever we've had larger grasshopper numbers, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, this is of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, so it's APHIS was what I'll call it, works with both public land managers and private land managers to fund large-scale pesticide spraying for grasshoppers. Now, you might imagine that if you're spraying large-scale grasshopper, if you're spraying pesticides over, in the case of Oregon, at least 30,000 acres, in the case of Montana, more than 1 million acres, you're both hurting grasshoppers, right? And I've just talked about why they're so important. But these insecticides are broad spectrum and can hurt pollinators, can hurt many of the other insects that are out on the land. So Xerces for 2 decades has had programs to try to deal with this issue, but it's a difficult issue because it's cyclical. Every 5-7 years, we have a big grasshopper outbreak, and then APHIS will swoop in and react incredibly fast with very little time for comments, very little time for lawsuits. In the past, we have been somewhat successful, or very successful in Idaho with a lawsuit in the past, but that was based on the Clean Water Act. They changed the Clean Water Act after that, so we cannot use that as a tool anymore. They were planning on spraying 20 million acres in Idaho in 2007. And we, along with a lot of local groups in Idaho, challenged that. And in the end, they sprayed still too much. They sprayed about 40,000 acres. So what you can do is if you're here in Oregon, is reach out to the Oregon Department of Agriculture, and I could get you a link. Write a letter, let them know, because APHIS works in most cases with the agricultural departments. Let them know that you feel this is a problem. Misha, if I send you information, can you pass it along to folks? So I will go ahead and send that out. She can pass that along. This is a really, really important issue. I finally was able to raise money to get dedicated staff to work on this issue. I'm so excited because I work on everything, and I was our grasshopper guy and our forest guy and our this guy and that guy, and I just couldn't do it all. So we're making some headway. We've got interest from the other thing you could do that would be helpful, and I'll put this in the email, is to reach out to Senator Merkley, who is sympathetic to this issue, but has a lot of things on his plate. We would be great if people reached out to him to let him know, respectfully, because Senator Merkley is trying to do the right thing, but get him to move this up in his priority list over the many. Michael, does that answer your question, I hope?
Oh yeah, that's a lot of really great info. And
great.
Thank you.
Great, and I'll send some more. We've got a couple blogs by my staff person who's working on it that have a lot of background information on this too.
Great, thank you. There's a question in the chat about bark beetles. The question reads, they're native, so don't they have native predators too? Could you share any info about biological controls or reiterate if you discussed and I missed it, that can be alternatives to, quote, addressing beetle outbreaks via logging?
Yes, the best way to address beetle outbreaks is through having a diverse, intact forest. There's so much data that just suggests that bark beetles become an issue much more in heavily managed forests that are simplified than they do in intact, diverse forests. And the reason is exactly what you said. We have a lot of native predators and parasitoids of bark beetles. One of the biggest predators of bark beetles are native woodpeckers. They preferentially go after many of the bark beetles that we have. But there are also many insects that are both predators and parasitoids. And what that parasitoid means is it's like a parasite, but a parasitoid always kills its host. So as an ecologist and entomologist, I always use the word parasitoid. A parasite might infect you. A parasitoid always kills you. And in the case of bark beetles, that's not a bad thing if you've got some native insect out there. But what we should be focused on is these diverse forests that attract these native insects, and that's called not classical biological control. It's basically ecological biological control. It's using the insects that are already in the system. And where we get into trouble is oftentimes we want to move a new insect from another place to control a quote unquote pest. So we're moving these animals around. So what we want to do is have intact forests build up this biodiversity, which basically is this feedback loop to keep everything in check. That is definitely the best way to focus on bark beetles. And then I will just end by saying, and then if we do have bark beetles, the thing you really don't want to do is go in and salvage log. That is the absolute worst thing to do after a bark beetle event, because once you have a bark beetle event, you will build up more and more predator and parasitoid insects, as well as birds like woodpeckers that are there because they have this incredibly rich resource. And if you take that resource out from under them, you're not building up those populations. So leaving these systems more natural is really what we need to be thinking about. And again, I am not, at this point, as you've seen, we do work on some small thinning projects and some other projects. And if people are thoughtful and we're thinking ecologically sometimes because systems are so out of whack, I'm not that we never do anything. And I know some people are, and I think that's a valid point of view, but we need to do less.
Great, thank you, Scott. If there's anyone who has any more questions, we can wait a couple minutes to see if anyone has more questions. If you're watching on Facebook, you can also leave a comment. And I am seeing those too. All right, we got a comment. I remember there is a small local organization called Pollinator Parkway that focuses on converting parking strips to native pollinator gardens to connect habitats. Just thought I would mention this in case anyone's interested.
Great.
I'm sure I could fill up all your time with questions too.
No, that's okay.
Similar to that last comment, I heard about a Freeway habitat project, and I was really curious about that as something that seemed semi-feasible, maybe for connecting habitats together, and providing more habitat for insects on a place that was already kind of open and sunny and not in people's grazing land and things.
Yeah, well, I could certainly address that because we do a lot of that work. So there are more than 10 million acres of roadsides for highways and freeways across the United States. 10 million acres, and much of that is just mown grass that either has been converted to non-native grass or might still be native, but is just they mow it all the time. And we have staff dedicated to working with departments of transportation to change the way that they manage roadsides, because roadsides certainly can be managed for pollinators. And oftentimes it's as simple as mowing less. And what's fascinating is mowing less also saves us all money because this is taxpayer dollars. And we've got good data to show from surveys where people got bussed around and looked at different types of projects along roadways that the public likes flowers along roadsides better than they like mowed grass. So it's like such a win-win-win thing. We actually just got language into the giant infrastructure bill that has also some good climate change things in it, that provides grant funding to departments of transportation to do just this, to put in habitat, native plant, and we were able to get the term locally adapted native plant habitat onto roadsides. So looks like hopefully this will pass the House. It's already passed the Senate. Our language is in both, and this will allow DOTs more funding to do this type of work.
Were you able to weigh in on any of the logging after the, last year's fires, or in regards to salvage logging? I know there's a lot of really fast logging happening this summer after last year's fires, and I was wondering if you had were able to participate in slowing that at all.
We participated with some comments, but we just, there's so many issues to try to address, and those happen so fast that it was just not an issue that we were able to be really engaged in. What I did do, because we do have colleagues at ODOT, some of the most egregious work is done along roadsides by ODOT, not by the Forest Service. And it's really, really problematic that the way they went about that. But no, we were not able to effectively weigh in to stop any of that. I just have to be honest. Wish I was.
Well, there's a lot to do.
Thanks for those questions. Are there any more questions?
And I'm just going to end by saying I always give talks, and sometimes I do nighttime talks. I didn't realize I just used the window. I didn't realize it's getting dark so early. So sorry, I'm kind of sitting in the dark now. Looks like I'm in the witness protection program. So.
It's surprising. It's sneaking up on me that it's getting dark early again. Not even that early, but still early compared to what it was. Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you so much, Scott, for this presentation and answering all those questions. I will follow up with an email to everybody who attended whenever you send over those resources. Thank you again. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
I just want to say thank you for what you do. My first organization was called Public Land Watch of Northern Colorado, doing exactly what you guys do here. And we need more of you out there doing exactly what you're doing. So thank you so much.
Right. Thanks, Scott. Okay. Well, I hope everyone has a good night. Thanks again for being here.